Hey guys, how you doing? This is Paul, and phones are getting cheaper and cheaper every year. And because of that, the line between smartphones and budget phones is really starting to blur. With amazing phones available like the Nexus 6P and OnePlus 3 for around $400 to $500, is it even worth it to save a couple hundred to go with the Moto G4 or G4 Plus? And what exactly will you be trading off? So I'd like to start out by clarifying the differences between the G4 Plus and the regular G4. And all you really need to know is that the G4 Plus has larger internal storage options, extra RAM depending on what model you buy, a slightly better camera, which I'll get to in just a minute, and a fingerprint sensor. So I've been using the G4 Plus as my daily driver for about the past month, and I've honestly not noticed a huge difference coming from my Nexus 6P. One of the most obvious differences, however, is the build quality. And coming from an all-metal phone like the 6P really makes it obvious that Lenovo was trying to cut down the cost of the phone by building it with some cheaper materials. So it's pretty much all plastic, and while it doesn't feel quite like a 6P or an iPhone in the hand, it could be a lot worse. The back is grippier than the average phone, which is nice, and it's also removable, which unfortunately does not allow you to take out the battery, but it does allow access to the SIM card slot and, more importantly, a micro SD card slot for expandable storage, which is becoming more and more rare to see in phones these days. Flipping the phone back to the front, you'll see the fingerprint scanner, and again, this is only on the G4 Plus model, but it's really great. It's lightning fast, about on par with the iPhone in my testing, and the only thing that I'm not a fan of is its squarish design. It just looks a little out of place on the bottom of the phone like that, but it's not a huge deal. On top, you'll also see the front-facing speaker, and from my experience, the speaker has delivered very loud and surprisingly clear sound. Good quality overall, but it is only on one side, so you won't be getting stereo sound like you have on the 6P. The display on the G4 and G4 Plus is one of the most impressive aspects of the phone. It's actually almost on par with many other flagships. So both phones feature a 5.5-inch 1080p display, which gives it a pixel density of 401 pixels per inch. And to put that in perspective, that's exactly the same resolution you'll see on the iPhone Plus models. Colors may be slightly lacking in saturation, but viewing angles are great, it's bright enough even in direct sunlight, and the sharpness is on point. So when you combine the solid display with the front-facing speaker, you have yourself a phone that can be a surprisingly good device for consuming media. Watching YouTube videos and movies is really enjoyable on this phone. The software is another solid aspect of the phone. It's running almost stock Android Marshmallow with a few of Lenovo's own features thrown in. Some of my favorite add-ons are the Moto Gestures. So for example, you can double chop to turn on the flashlight and twist the phone to get quick access to the camera. I found myself using these a lot more than I thought I would, so I'm definitely gonna miss those when I switch to another phone. Now, believe it or not, performance has actually been pretty snappy. The phone doesn't have top-of-the-line specs, but the only time I really noticed any slowdown or lag was when I had many apps running at the same time, or if I was playing some graphically intensive games. So one of the few areas that I feel could be a deal breaker for some people is the camera on the G4 and G4 Plus. This is one of those instances where on paper, the camera looks like it would be fine. The G4 has a 13 megapixel camera with an f2.0 aperture, and the G4 Plus has a slightly better 16 megapixel camera with an f2.0 aperture. But in my testing, the cameras performed mediocre at best. The G4 Plus was slightly sharper than the G4 and generally produced better pictures. However, if you put it side by side with something like the Nexus 6P, it's just no comparison. The dynamic range on the 6P is far better, color reproduction and sharpness is better. It's just an overall much better camera. I noticed the G4 and G4 Plus had a particularly difficult time with focusing on objects that were closer to the camera, and pictures like this tended to turn out even blurrier than normal. The cameras were also very inconsistent, with some pictures being way too saturated and some needed more saturation. And video recording on the cameras unfortunately was not very good as well. They record at 1080p at 30 FPS, but the video was often over sharpened and again with poor dynamic range. You also don't get any additional camera features that flagships normally offer, like slow motion video. So if you're someone who uses their smartphone camera all the time, this could easily be a deal breaker and should be one of the first things taken into consideration when thinking about purchasing the phone. But to wrap things up on a good note, the battery life was pretty good on the G4 and G4 Plus. I could normally get around 4 to 5 hours of screen on time. However, on some heavier days of usage, it did die before the end of the day. But it also has quick charge, which is incredible. I was able to charge from 1% all the way to 80% in just 1 hour. So if you can hook up the phone to the charger for even just a few minutes, you can get quite a bit of battery life. For $150 for the G4 and $200 for the G4 Plus, these phones are simply amazing for the money. It may be clear that they're budget phones, but they could easily be a daily driver for most people, especially if you're not too concerned with the build quality or the camera. So that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you did like it, please give me a thumbs up down below and subscribe for some more content coming soon. Thanks.